Thank you. Napandulwe, are you there? Can you put your camera on for a sec, just so we can see you? Um, there. Hi. We're just going to both do our visual introductions now, so to make it easier later on. And I should warn you that Napandulwe's Wi-Fi is a bit in and out today, so
Yes.
we'll have to do our best. My name's Nicola, and I am a white woman in my mid-40s, and I'm wearing glasses, and behind you can see an enormous record collection. Napandulwe.
Yes, my name is Napandulwe Shiweda. I'm also I'm in my early 40s. I'm a black woman with short blonde hair. Thank you.
So I'm going to start, and then halfway through I will hand over to Napandulwe, and she'll speak about the second half. She'll deliver the second half of this paper. I should say before I start that I am no longer the head of collections at the Powell-Cotton Museum. I was when we did this work, and I was when we submitted the abstract, but I am not. So yeah, just to be clear about that. I mean, Napandulwe and I, while we were writing this paper last week, one of the things we were talking about is the however much we have tried to shift power around within our project. And I think we began this morning with an introduction that talks about thinking critically about the power you hold and the power you can share, but that ultimately we're kind of doing that within a structure that will that limits severely how much power can actually be handed over. The museum continues to retain the majority of the power, and Shreya Sharma talked about that in more eloquently when she talked about structural change. I'm just going to share my screen. So where's it gone? There it is. Thank you. Share screen. Oh, hang on. Okay, great. So Napandulwe and I were first introduced in about 2017, and we've been working closely together since 2019. She's based in Namibia, and I'm here in I'm talking to you from London today. So most of our work focuses on colonial era collections of art and personal possessions that come from the border region of Angola and Namibia. And hopefully you can see my cursor, but this is Namibia and this is Angola, and we're looking specifically at this borderland region between the two countries today. So although a lot of our work is historical, today we're talking about a display that opened in June this year that focuses on the work of 6 contemporary craftswomen from the Oshana region of northern Namibia, which on this other map is very close to this little purple line, which crosses the border between Angola in the north and Namibia in the south. And actually, all of the women live extremely close to this line. The contemporary collecting very much comes out of the historic research. So after I introduce the display, I'll talk briefly about the background to the project before Napandulwe will talk in more detail about the practice of collecting and the issues around power dynamics that we encountered in this project. So this is an image of Namibian Narratives, which is a permanent display at the Powell-Cotton Museum, which is in Thanet on the North Kent coast. It features the work of these 6 women, the work of these 6 women: Tresia Shikuja, Sarah Waliwala, Simone, Rebecca Hialulwa, and then on the bottom line, Lucia Kenjengo, Ndahafa Kakonda, and Lina Mwatapunga. And all of the women, we'll talk a bit more about the commissioning process, but all of the women were asked to make something that represented themselves. They were given free rein to make whatever they wanted. They all make a range of craft projects, but everybody chose to make items of clothing associated with the transition of girls to womanhood. And we think that's because that's actually a really central part of Ambo culture, of the culture of this region that we're talking about. And so it's what you see here is before they went on display. It's cotton skirts, beaded skirts, as well as an array of beaded jewelry, just to give you an idea of the kind of material we're talking about. In order to understand a bit about why this small display is so important, it's important to understand a little bit about the context in which it sits. And the Powell-Cotton Museum is an inherently colonial institution. It has extensive natural history and ethnographic collections amassed by one family between 1886 and 1939 because of the privileges that the British Empire afforded them. The museum was founded the museum was founded by the British big game hunter and collector Percy Powell-Cotton, who inherited Queck's estates, where the museum is located. The income from the estate allowed him to indulge his interest in travel, ethnography, photography, and in particular, a love of sport and big game hunting. And for almost 40 years, he was engaged continuously in hunting and collecting exhibitions, originally in Asia, but with a focus that soon shifted to Africa. The collection and the museum are quintessentially colonial in nature. The origin of Asia and Africa made it possible to travel and collect in this way. And the museum is dominated by its large and impressive natural history displays, but there are also several museums containing historic material from Africa as well. Two of Powell-Cotton's daughters, Diana and Toni, followed in his footsteps, and during the 1930s, they had both undertaken trips with him to Somaliland and South Africa, respectively, before embarking on 2 trips to southwestern Angola together, but without their father, in 1936 and 1937. They were much more focused on ethnographic collecting than their father had been. Although he had been very diligent about making notes in the field and recording the locations of purchases, the sisters take this to a whole new level. And they're creating reams of notes, drawings, and photographs, which are now in the museum's extensive archive. This is the largest and most important human history collection within the museum, and in total, the 2 sisters collected approximately 5,000 objects from southwestern Angola and northern Namibia as an act of salvage anthropology. About half of these objects remain in the museum, while the rest were donated or sold to other more prestigious institutions, the British Museum being the biggest recipient. One of the things that is difficult to express is the extent to which colonial legacies and violence remain visible within the Powell-Cotton Museum. Between us, and Napandulwe and I have worked in, for, and studied a large number of museums in Europe and Africa. And we agree that the displays, as they stood when Napandulwe first visited the museum in 1929, were the most shocking we had encountered. Hopefully these images give some sense of the extent to which the museum was designed as, and remains, a giant trophy cabinet. Napandulwe and I began researching this collection as part of the Making African Connections project, which sought to, it was an AHRC funded project run by the University of Sussex, and it explored 3 colonial era collections of historically significant African material held in the museums of Kent and Sussex. And I'm delighted that some other partners from that project are also at this session. In other words, we were looking at African history in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. And while researching the historic collection in 2019, Napandulwe interviews Tresia Shakudja as part of the project. And we were doing photo elicitation interviews with a number of elders. And Tresia proved to be the most knowledgeable and enthusiastic of the people we met. And Tresia is part of the Kwanyama Queen's retinue, so she has a specific responsibility to foster the heritage and culture of the Kwanyama people. And the Kwanyama people are one of a number of ethnic groups from this region. Furthermore, she explained that her detailed knowledge of traditional culture was due to the fact that her parents had not converted to Christianity, although she herself later did. So she was brought up practicing things that converts considered taboo. And while talking to Tressia, she began to show us contemporary versions of the historic objects in the museum collection, summoning her daughters and husband to act as models while she demonstrated how things should be worn. She spoke eloquently and passionately about how much she wanted to share Kwanyama culture with the wider world and instill pride in young Kwanyama. She was the catalyst and inspiration for this project. And when I told the then head of collections, Imbal Livni, about Tressia, she suggested we apply to Arts Council England for funding, and so the project was born. The newly commissioned objects are the first contemporary display in the museum for well over 50 years. So this was a major step for a museum grappling with a colonial legacy where Africa remains a place out of time, trapped in a relentless ethnographic present. Namibian Narratives was a direct response to the colonial nature of the museum's collection and part of the museum's public commitment to reimagine itself and decolonize. The project sought to differentiate itself from earlier collecting practices by being led by someone from the region, Napandulwe. So at this point, I'll hand over to her and she can talk more about the project itself and how Power operated within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. As I'm seeing now, when I put on my video, I saw that the internet is unstable, so I'll stop the video so I can just speak to this. Yeah, right. Although Inbo and Nicola were keen that I should lead on the project from the outset, there were a number of ways in which the museum retained power, not least the decision to act on my decision and the ability to apply for money to do it. Other limits included the display had to go into a certain space and not exceed a certain budget. The budget in this case was an issue as Arts Council England grants only allow you to spend 20% of the total budget outside the UK, and we had considerable costs in Namibia. The museum also provided part of the budget to try and counteract these, but all the objects were purchased with the core funds rather than through the grant money. It's worth noting here that there were items that the women had showed us, but which were not for sale. So they were actually just, this felt like an important assertion of power, particularly as we know that in the 1930s, people were coerced into selling things. However, we did have a limited budget, which meant that although although, let me just find my sorry, I couldn't find my notes. Sorry, yes, I was saying it's worth noting that we had a limited budget, which meant that although we were keen for the women to make whatever they wanted, like Nicola said, it did come with some inbuilt limitations. And in this process, we see power operating in complex and shifting ways. When I first visited the museum, I was surprised by the quality and size of both the collection and the archive. Me being a historian and also a visual culture specialist who studies this region, there were things that I have never seen before because due to colonial history and missionary influence, they have become very rare in the places where they were made. There were certain dolls and other objects that are obviously I first saw at the museum, which I have never seen in Namibia before. However, I had a number of concerns about the displays, and we hope to address some of these problems. Like we hope to address some of these problems in a variety of ways, including through this display. One of the most common problems with African displays in the UK and generally in Europe is that they're entirely made up of colonial era artifacts, but they are not presented with any historical context, and that was one of the concerns that we had. This creates the impression that places in Africa are the same now as they were then. that Africa is unchanging and it is traditional rather than part of the contemporary world. We hope that by contrasting the historical displays with new work, we could create a sense of change over time and acknowledgement that this was a real place where people live. The contemporary work is in dialogue with the historic, with the historic display. Another thing that we also hoped for was to shift the power balance, from the museum to the women through our commissioning process. A criticism of the historic display was that it was heavily biased towards the Powell-Cotton sisters' ideas and achievements, and there was no reference, or there is no reference to the local people that worked with them in creating the collection. No makers were acknowledged or named. So Nicola and I are currently writing up some research on these individuals and how, although they were initially recorded and credited in the sisters' notes, they were gradually erased from the narrative and replaced with these ethnographic or anthropological types. It goes without saying that we wanted to name the women and credit them for their work. But we also asked that they create something that they felt represented themselves, like Nicola said earlier, and that also represented their own personal stories rather than represent the whole culture or ethnic group. All of these women work within a Novambo tradition, but we wanted to emphasize their personal motivations. For example, Ndahafa Kakonda, who talked about how the creative process allowed her time to think, and that she felt as though she was threading beads. When she felt that she was threading these beads, she was untangling her own thoughts. Laina, on the other hand, explained that she wanted to give a cloth skirt because while Namibia was under South African rule, she had been able to access both cloth and a sewing machine through her brothers who were traveling into the police zone as migrant laborers. So this had allowed her and her family to build a business, and they still run a small textile shop in the region. A video filmed by Erasmus Stefanos on he's a local filmmaker, but edited in the UK, shows the women talking about their artistic practice and in some cases making, the objects. So in terms of creating the actual display, I traveled to the UK last year in June to oversee the design of the display and begin installation work. So ultimately, my power was limited, of course, by lack of access, as I could only be there for 1 week. So I had to trust that Nicola and the team would follow my plan and keep me informed of all the small decisions necessary to make as the project progressed. One of the things that were really really important to me was to try and show the skirts, especially the one that that one skirt is the or both skirts, because we have a cloth one and also the beaded skirt, that that they should appear on, like we should show it as they would appear on a body without using a mannequin. And I'm grateful to Natalie Michel, the conservator at the Powell-Cotton Museum, for her work with which made that possible. I personally feel that mannequins are highly problematic because they remind me of plaster casts of the faces and body parts of live persons, in particular San and Damara people found in museums in Namibia and South Africa, which were done in a manner which was traumatic, violent, and dangerous. So one of the things that shocked me most when I had first visited the museum was a model of a Cameroonian weaver in a glass box. So while mannequins are used to try and give life to objects in a South African context, in somewhere else, I think, they also evoke a sense of death. So our work has sought to address the historic imbalance of power embedded in museum collections of African artifacts. However, the display stands in a building deeply embedded in colonialism, which bears the Powell-Cotton name. This demonstrates clearly the limits to the power of contemporary collecting to undermine colonial narratives, as we are, the ones that, I didn't really attend everything, but, this is actually what we are trying to do redress or ways that were done previously. So recently, both Nicola and I have been reminded in different ways of the limits of our own power to undertake this work. Changes obviously in UK visa restrictions make it much harder for me to visit the UK. So I could be blocked from visiting the exhibition, even if the barriers of distance and cost were surmountable. Nicola had resigned, like she said earlier, from the Powell-Cotton Museum following a dispute with the CEO and the trustees over an ethical issue, and has been told that she's not allowed on site. So just to conclude, we are both therefore unable to visit the exhibition and have ultimately been left powerless. Thank you so much for listening.